everybody. Welcome to Daniel Davis Deep Dive, coming to you live from Washington, D.C. We got a really good show for you today. Something's going to be really useful and interesting, I believe. You know, everybody's certainly aware of the Israel-Hamas war. People know the history of where the IDF came from, where Israel came from. A lot of that's been in the news a lot lately. But one thing that may not be in the Western media, at least as much, is an understanding of what Hamas is. Of course, Israel's talking about how they're, this terrorist organization, but a lot of people are a little confused about some things like, well, how is a terrorist organization living right next to Israel all these years? And where did they come from? So we're going to answer some of that today. And we have our resident expert here, Professor Omer Bartov from Brown University. Former IDF officer, nobody more qualified to answer some of these things. And he's certainly a subject matter expert on this. And glad to have you back for this important discussion, Professor Bartov.
Thank you very much for having me here.
So I think that this is a really important thing to get right for people to understand, because it kind of helps understand some of the dynamics that are involved, why certain actors are acting the way they are. And as we want to discuss here in this episode, what's kind of come next? Where can we expect things to go from here? What does the future hold? I think all those things are very important. So we want to start off really by, trying to find out a little bit about where did Hamas come from? And on the other side of these coming clips here, I'm going to ask you to talk about the literal origin of them, where they first came from. But when they first started hitting American scenes was probably somewhere around 2005, when Israel decided to redeploy out of the Gaza Strip, and that turned into be a bit of a problem, as you'll see from these clips.
For his part, Prime Minister Ariel Sharon praised the security forces at this morning's meeting. He also leveled sharp criticism at the some 5,000 opponents to his disengagement plan who have slipped into Gaza in the past weeks. Meanwhile, Housing Minister Isaac Herzog called on Gaza's Jewish residents not to violate the IDF's evacuation orders.
We are today carrying out a very, very painful operation in pulling out Israeli citizens from their homes. We hope that most of the settlers today will order and obey the orders, take out their chattels, pack themselves, and move to their new locations.
So that last figure there, then Housing, I believe, Secretary Herzog, you're gonna come back and see him again in a few minutes. But you see right there, he was saying to the Israelis, "Hey, I know this is painful, but this is something that we got to do." The Israelis, however, at that time were very unhappy about that, as we see in this report.
Jewish settlers have until midnight tonight to get out of Gaza or be removed by force.
When the pullout happened, the army had to forcibly remove many Israeli settlers from their homes, deeply dividing the country.
This is just a trauma for the nation of Israel, dividing their country, pitting the right wing against the army.
In Washington, President George W. Bush had been pushing the Palestinians to quickly take advantage of the moment and hold democratic elections.
Mr. President, we will work with you to help realize the dream of a free and democratic Palestine.
The Bush administration threw its support behind the Palestinian leader Mahmoud Abbas, who'd taken over since the death of Yasser Arafat.
Welcome back to the White House.
Abbas and his Fatah party were unpopular among many Palestinians, who saw them as corrupt and ineffective. Hamas decided to run against them.
In 2006, when Hamas runs, they run a disciplined campaign. The slogan was, "We'll provide good governance. We'll fight corruption. And Islam is the answer." That's how they ran.
It was open, free elections which were promoted by the United States of America, not by us. We didn't like the idea. But under the pressure of the Americans, we did it. And Hamas won.
The sweeping victory by Hamas is being described as a political earthquake. Already those aftershocks being felt in Gaza.
Hamas's election victory in 2006 was a surprise to everyone, including Hamas.
So you had in that situation, you see up to that point, a lot of displeasure among the Palestinian side with the Palestinian Authority and their corruption and all the things in their ineffectiveness, which opened the door for Hamas, which was also helped to be opened by the Bush administration, who actually wanted to bring peace to the Middle East, wanted to have a two-state solution and kind of bring things into some kind of equilibrium. That was the intent. But the result was a guy named Haniyeh who took power.
The leader of the Palestinian movement, Hamas, Ismail Haniyeh, sacked as prime minister by President Mahmoud Abbas, has launched an appeal for a long-term ceasefire with Israel.
Is there any possibility of recognizing Israel?
First of all, let Israel recognize Hamas.
But there's a dilemma.
Israel is an occupying country, occupying land and the Palestinian people. The normal thing would be for Israel to recognize Palestinian rights so we can create our country.
Can you imagine a day when Hamas will extend a hand to Israel?
Hamas has always said we're ready for a long-lasting ceasefire. Maybe 10 years, maybe 20, if we can have a state based on the borders of 1967.
So we're going to see that face again here in a minute as well. But it was really stark that even at that early phase, when the repeatedly pressed, will you recognize that Israel has a right to simply exist, that he just would not do it. And that, I think, kind of set the stage for what kind of happened over the years, and certainly has been exploited since October the 7th. So I wonder first, Professor, if you can kind of tell us a little bit about where did Hamas come from originally, and how did the corruption in the PA help bring them into power?
No, thank you again for having me. Hamas was founded in 1987. It was initially, before its foundation as Hamas, was part of a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a movement of Islamic fundamentalists that dates back to the 1920s in Egypt. Initially, when it was established, it was a relatively moderate organization, and it was known as providing services for the population of Gaza, social services, schools, and so forth. And it was in contradiction to the Fatah, the PLO rule, which was becoming increasingly corrupt. Hamas became radicalized gradually during the first Intifada of 1987, and then the second, the Al-Aqsa Intifada of 2000, in which it engaged massively, causing hundreds of casualties among Israeli citizens. So this is a slow process. It's interesting to note from the clips that you showed that Haniyeh, in his interview, speaks actually about the possibility of having a Palestinian state next to an Israeli state, although he does not recognize the right of that state to exist, but at least as what he says is a ceasefire for many years.
Yeah, 10 to 20
this was
years.
not originally. Yeah, this was not originally the Hamas Charter of 1988 does not recognize that possibility at all. And so from that point of view, Hamas moderated its views somewhat in negotiations with the PLO, which is the other major organization of Palestinians. But those positions have become radicalized again in recent years. So we have a kind of shift from a moderate Hamas to a more radical Hamas, than to an attempt to adapt itself to the PLO, to the realities on the ground, and then again, a more radical position right now. And it's important to understand why that is the case.
Yeah, and so what led to the recent shift? Because you said they kind of were radicalized even in the second Intifada, et cetera, but then another level up apparently just a few years ago. What led to that?
Well, I mean, the interpretation would be that this is a function of both the relationship between Hamas and the PLO, which is the ruling entity, if you can call it ruling entity, but it has some power in the West Bank, and response to Israeli policies. Hamas, by and large, argues that all of Palestine, the entire land of Palestine, should become, in the future, an Islamic Palestinian state. That is not the position of the PLO, A, because the PLO speaks about a secular state, and B, because the PLO has agreed to actually share the territory with Israel. It also is not in agreement with the policies of Israel, which for a long time, over the Oslo Accords process, had agreed to the idea that there would be two states, and then reneged on that idea under Netanyahu, and no longer wants to speak about the possibility of a two states. And so you can understand the positions of Hamas also as a response to these two entities.
Yeah, we're actually going to touch on that a little bit more in a separate segment of this episode here. But I wonder if you could also explain something that is also unclear to a lot of Westerners, especially, is that there is a lot of friction and dynamic between the Palestinian Authority and Hamas. Because, I mean, a lot of people say, one's on the Palestinian Authority or the Gaza Strip, one's in the West Bank, and, they're both Palestinians, but there's a significant difference between the two, right?
There is a big difference, which has to do, first of all, just with the power struggle between two competing organizations that would like to be the main political representatives of the Palestinians, but also because ideologically they are very different. The PLO generally is secular, and its own origins are Marxist. It begins in the if you look at the early pictures of Arafat and his people, they were educated, many of them in Eastern Europe. They were supported by the Soviet Union, so they had a very different kind of origin. Whereas Hamas comes from the Muslim Brotherhood. These are Islamic fundamentalists who are seen as particularly radical also in Arab states.
Right. Okay. So that makes sense. And that unfortunately for the Palestinian people in both Gaza and the West Bank is, puts tension in there in addition to what they have outside, which certainly exacerbates the problem. But now nothing has exacerbated the problem as October the 7th. And that has just sent both sides into complete polar opposites. And as we showed in the early part, you said then Minister Herzog was trying to tell the Israeli people, hey, this is something you got to do. We're going to have to move out to get some peace. But now here's where he's at today.
Civilian population from the center of the battle, in warning citizens, in monitoring humanitarian situation. But Israel will defend its people and do whatever it takes with an iron fist to change the reality.
And I think we've certainly seen that turn into reality indeed, as he said on the ground. On the other side, you had that same Hania, who we saw earlier in 2007. He is also much more defiant.
No immigration from Gaza, no relocation from the West Bank, no immigration from Gaza to Egypt. And here I need to praise the stand of our brothers in Egypt who are confirming that Egypt is a sisterly country and is a supporting country. Egypt welcomes the sons and daughters of the Palestinian people, but under no name such as immigration or relocation. I'm telling my brothers in Egypt, our decision is to stay in our lands.
So he is flat out. You have Herzog saying we are going to win no matter what with an iron fist. You have Hania saying we're not going anywhere. Previously, you've had Netanyahu say we won't even talk to the Palestinian Authority. The objective is their destruction. So something's going to have to give here.
Yes, and it's interesting that you show Herzog, who right now has really no power. He's a president who is a sort of, it's just a formal position. The decision makers are Netanyahu, his cabinet, and the military. And what they appear to be trying to do right now in the operation in Gaza is to empty much of Gaza of its Palestinian population. One of the ministers, Minister of Agriculture, but a man who was early in his previous career, was head of the Internal Security Service, Avi Dichter, talked about this as Nakba 2023. And the Nakba is the expulsion of the Palestinians in 1948. 1.8 million Palestinians have been displaced in Gaza. That's 85% of the population, and they've been crammed into a corner of the Gaza Strip. And much of the area in which they lived has been flattened by aerial bombardments, artillery, tanks, and bulldozers. And so when Hamas leader says that we don't want to go to Egypt, Egypt does not want Palestinians to be there. Palestinians want to stay in their homes. Most of them are refugees already from 1948 and their descendants. And Israel would love them to go to Egypt, or for that matter, to any other place.
Anywhere,
so that the same people that you showed who were removed from Gaza in 2005, the Jewish settlers, now have created a movement of returning there. This time, hopefully, without any Palestinians being there at all. So how do we end this? We cannot end it through population removal, through artillery, through tanks, and we cannot end it with such radical leaders as the Hamas leaders or the current Israeli government. You have to change them in order to actually bring peace to that area.
And I think to underscore that, there has been a lot of reporting in even mainstream media in recent weeks that Netanyahu has actually been playing kind of a double game openly to prevent that very thing from happening, as we see in this clip here.
Israeli PM Benjamin Netanyahu was against a Palestinian state was reported as recently as July by the Jerusalem Post. It said Palestinian hopes of establishing a sovereign state must be eliminated. This is what Netanyahu told members of a parliament committee in a closed-door meeting. This is according to that article. Netanyahu's remarks came as he was discussing plans for a scenario that did not have Mahmoud Abbas at the helm of the Palestinian Authority. But Netanyahu also said that Israel needed the Palestinian Authority and shouldn't let it completely collapse. This is the fine balancing that Israel under Netanyahu has been trying to do for years now. Keep power centers between the West Bank and Gaza separate, neither let the Palestinian Authority get strong, nor allow it to collapse. And more importantly, prop up Hamas.
And so now you see that, I mean, you just have to admit that at least on one level, he has been successful in doing that. And this horrible thing on 10/7 kind of blew up in his face. But now it kind of looks like he's trying to take advantage of that, because here's what he said earlier this very day.
אנחנו ממשיכים במלחמה עד הסוף. היא תימשך עד לחיסול החמאס, עד לניצחון. מי שחושב שנעצור, פשוט לא מחובר למציאות. לא נפסיק את הלחימה עד להשגת כל המטרות שהצבנו. חיסול החמאס, שחרור חטופינו, והסרת האיום מעזה. אנחנו תוקפים את החמאס באש תופת, בכל מקום, כולל היום. אנחנו גם תוקפים את עוזריהם, מקרוב ומרחוק. כל מחבלי החמאס, מהראשון עד האחרון, הם בני מוות. יש להם רק שתי אפשרויות, להיכנע או למות.
So, I mean, you see he's very clear there and pretty graphic. They're all dead men walking, all of them, from the first to the last, whether in Israel or even outside, which is a clear reference to those who are in Qatar and elsewhere, that nobody is going to be safe anywhere, which does not imply even the theoretical concept of a potential two-state solution. And yet you have President Biden saying that, yes, a two-state solution is what we're seeking. And you have the National Security Advisor, Sullivan, adding this.
We do believe that the Palestinian Authority needs to be revamped and revitalized, needs to be updated in terms of its method of governance, its representation of the Palestinian people, and starting with the president, Mahmoud Abbas, who I will go see. And ultimately, it's going to be up to the Palestinian people to work through their representation, and it will be up to those leaders of the Palestinian Authority to work through the types of steps that they need to take to reform and update the authority for the situation we face today.
Okay, so the question is, if Netanyahu's on a path to completely eliminate any political possibility for Hamas to even exist, much less negotiate anything in the future, and if the Palestinian Authority has been so weakened over decades and their own self-corruption on top of that, and the U.S. wants there to be a two-state solution. How do you square those two seemingly opposite conditions?
Well, first of all, Netanyahu's main goal is to survive. And as long as the war continues, he can say that he's not going to go anywhere because he has to finish the war. His problem is that the war is not going very well. The Israeli army is a big army, modern air force and artillery, tanks, and so forth. And it's fighting a very small guerrilla force for weeks now, and it hasn't actually been able to remove the leadership of Hamas. And I don't think that it will succeed in doing so. It's just created a huge humanitarian crisis. So that's one issue. As long as Netanyahu is in power, and I know it seems quite clear that the US administration knows that, as long as he is in power, it will be impossible to change the political paradigm. And one has to change the political paradigm in order to solve this issue. Once you remove Netanyahu and the people around him, the even more extreme elements, right-wing elements around him, the settlers, people like Smotrich and Ben Gvir, once you remove them, then you can start thinking about revamping, as the administration says, revamping the Palestinian leadership. There are potential Palestinian leaders. They're mostly in Israeli jails, and they have to be released from Israeli jails. There are people who have credibility both in Gaza, where I think Hamas has lost much of its credibility because of the destruction it brought on Gaza, and in the West Bank. And they could negotiate at least the initial phases of a way for Jews and Palestinians to share that land. It's clear from what happened now, even to those who did not believe it before, that it would be impossible to continue killing each other, that each round is deadlier than the previous one, and that one has to find a way for the 7 million Jews and 7 million Palestinians living between the Jordan and the sea to live together. That can only be done politically, not militarily.
Okay, so now, and I completely agree with you, but we have some real tension against that possibility. And I'd like you to address this particular issue. So Netanyahu there very clearly says he is intending to use military power to destroy Hamas. But as we've talked about several times, Hamas is more of a concept and an idea than it is like a physical army that you can, manually and physically destroy, because physically in the Gaza Strip, I don't know how Israel, the IDF, would even identify all of the Hamas fighters, because you're looking over there. How do you know that that guy's a Hamas fighter, or he's just a man who happens to be standing there because you just blew up his house or killed some of his family members, so he's angry?
Correct.
And you see that there's no list. So, I mean, physically, how would the IDF ever say they have accomplished Netanyahu's military objective?
There are only two ways to do it. One is to remove the population from Gaza, which would be ethnic cleansing. Just move everyone out. And then whoever is in Hamas will be within the population that has been removed. Or to remove the roots of power of Hamas. Hamas thrives on desperation and hopelessness. If you give the population another option, most of the people in Gaza, as in the past, will choose another option. They would rather have a future for themselves and for their children, rather than to die in these kind of horrible wars, bombing campaigns, and destruction. And to live under a rule of Hamas, which itself has become both very corrupt and is ideologically extremely dogmatic. So you have to change the politics of it, or to carry out ethnic cleansing and genocide. And hopefully Israel will not be allowed to do that.
Yeah, there's going to be huge tension there with Washington and with the West in general, and it's already starting to grow quite a bit, especially in Europe. The discomfort with the large scale death of the Palestinian people is already starting to really go up, and you've had people calling for ceasefires, stalwart allies of the United States. If it becomes evident that Netanyahu genuinely has no interest in actually having to coexist with the Palestinian people, and he starts to try to get them out there, I suspect that could cross an actual red line, even for the Biden White House, that says, hey, we're not going to support an actual in-your-face genocide. So that would seem to put Netanyahu on a path that can't be succeeded either militarily or politically or diplomatically. And so that is not a good thing for the Palestinian people or the Israeli people.
No, and look, the U.S. government can change Israeli policy if it decides to. Israel has become, during this war, in fact, highly dependent on massive American assistance with munitions, with artillery, with tank shells, and of course rockets.
Yeah.
And the US can say, if you are not listening to us, we don't feel obliged anymore to provide these kind of weapons that you're using now to not only fight Hamas, but actually to ethnically cleanse the Gaza Strip. This is not good for American policy. It's not good from my point of view for Israel. And it has to end. And I'm hoping that the administration will begin to, put its money where its mouth is and say, you cannot continue this. And Netanyahu himself is a pragmatic guy. He's saying all of this basically for consumption, for internal consumption. Much of what happened on October 7th was a result of his own policies. And he has never taken responsibility for it. And now he's trying to appear like the sort of bully in the neighborhood. If the U.S. government puts more pressure on him, there's a very good possibility that he would change his mind. But it's not doing it yet. And he, like everybody else in the Middle East, only understands the language of power, not just talk.
Yeah, and I think that's really putting the thing into the situation into the real harsh light that it's in. And that's how difficult it is going to be out, because for Biden to do that, he's going to have to break with traditional American political convention, which of course has been reflexively pro-Israel all the time, and strongly so. And certainly after 10/7, that was put on supercharge. And to now try to shift gears on that in the middle of a war, now at the beginning of a political campaign season for the White House, is going to be enormously difficult. But unfortunately, reality is imposing itself here, and he's not going to get to choose not to. Biden is either going to be passively standing by while Netanyahu does what he's in the process of doing, or he's going to have to potentially buck his own people and many of his supporters and say, we're going to put the brakes on Netanyahu. And that's a really tall ask for an American politician, but one that I think is going to be posed on him. He's going to have to make a choice one way or the other, and it's a hard one.
Yes, I agree. Look, and I think what Biden can do and should do is to explain that putting pressure on the Israeli government to follow a different political course is not only in American national interest, it's also in the national interest of the state of Israel. And that point has not been made clearly enough. It's crucial to understand that the language of power, while it is useful in the Middle East, cannot bring peace, cannot settle this, what appears to be an intractable conflict.
Yeah, that is such a great point. We have a saying that we say here on the show periodically, that you can't kill your way to peace. And man, is that ever, it doesn't matter how big the imbalance in power between Israel and Hamas, they can't kill their way to peace. And there's going to have to be some political accommodation on both sides. And I agree. I don't see any way that the Netanyahu-led government is going to be able to make the right decisions that need to be made, or Hania on the Palestinian side. I think probably for there to be a chance to peace, somehow both of those guys are going to have to get out. And I don't have any idea how either of those would happen.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, with the Hamas, it's hard to say. I think that there can be a process, and I think the administration is actually considering it, to bring some kind of police force into Gaza to make sure that there's law and order there, not under Israeli troops. Hamas has been weakened. It won't disappear, but it has weakened.
Yeah.
So I think that is one part of it. The second is that Netanyahu and the people around him, they would like to reverse things, to go back to before October 7th, to manage the conflict. But it has been shown that that policy is a failed policy.
Yeah.
And so you need to find another way of going about this. And the only way to do that is to have a more moderate leadership on both sides that can't come only from within. It has to come from the US. It has to come from European powers that would be that would try to both, I'd say, reconstruct Gaza, help create a more moderate Palestinian leadership, but have an end goal, a clear political end goal, that at the end of this process, there will be two independent states, that both people will have a right of self-determination, a right of return, and an ability to live in security next to each other. That is crucial. If you provide this kind of political goal, then the power of people, both in Hamas and of the radical Jewish right, will greatly diminish. But it has to be put in front of people's eyes. They have to be told there is a better future than simply killing each other.
Yeah, that's it's extremely well said, because that's the kind of opinion that we've had here, that if Palestinian and Jewish people don't both have peace, nobody's going to have peace. You can't have one or the other. You've got to have both. And I think that is at least theoretically possible, but it's going to take some good leadership. And we are so grateful to have you come on and help us illuminate these things, because it is a horrible, messy situation, but it's not completely without hope if we can get some visionary leaders to enter the scene. And we'll just have to pray that that comes very soon. But I know you got to go. I know you have another appointment you got to make. So we're very grateful to have you here and look forward to having you back again on very soon.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you very much. And that's all we have for you today on Deep Dive. We've got a number of other good shows on for you tomorrow on some of these same topics. And so definitely tune in here. We remain unintimidated and uncompromised on bringing you the truth and what you need to know to make sense out of your life. And we ask you to like and subscribe and share with your friends, especially in this season of giving, so that they have access to this same kind of information you're just not getting anywhere else. Thanks, and we'll see you next time on Deep Dive.